I ask that everyone please take your seats. We're going to begin. We'd like to begin right on time and end right on time. I know most of you have places to go. My name is Ross Sandler. I'm professor of law at New York Law School and director of the Center for New York City Law, and I welcome you to our City Law Breakfast. These breakfasts, as you know, are co-sponsored by Con Edison, Verizon, the Murray Goodgold Foundation, and Greenberg Traurig, and we're very pleased to have that continuing support, which allows us to have these breakfasts and not charge, and to bring important speakers to the civic community. Today we have Chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, Robert Tierney. You can see, Bob, there are lots of people here who are interested in perhaps the question. No, wait, I haven't introduced you yet. So, are you anxious? You're not leaving, are you? Are you leaving? Bob has had a very long record in government, almost a fixture, it seems to me. Assistant counsel to the governor, Governor Kerry, during the fiscal crisis. Counsel to Mayor Koch. He's worked now at the Landmarks Preservation Commission as chair for, 3 or 4 years? 5 years, in a period when the chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission has to be under enormous pressure. We haven't been in a building boom of this dimension in a very long time, and a lot of the focus of civic groups and people concerned about New York City and how it looks and what its quality of life should be, think a lot about the Landmarks Preservation Commission. He comes well prepared, a Yale graduate, Vanderbilt Law School, and now as a seasoned chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, we welcome Robert Tierney.
Thank you, Ross, and good morning, everybody here. Thanks for getting up at this early hour to get down here. Not always easy, but it's a great breakfast to come to. First, the sponsors. Ross has already thanked them, but Tom Dunn, my friend from Verizon, I want to single him out for special thanks for having there are other friends who have done it too, but Tom's a particular friend from the old days, and thank them for hosting the breakfast. And you have the Abney breakfast and the Crane breakfast. This is the best breakfast in town. This really is, and that's why you're all here. and Alice Sandler in the back of the room, and Ross. It's an unbeatable team, and it's free. So I couldn't be happier to be here. I come to almost all of them. I was here a month ago for Speaker Christine Quinn. Always interesting, always exciting. There's a mix of people. The diversity of New York is here. The students are here. They shake things up. That's always good. And the practitioners and whoever else wanders into this room. But it makes for a very lively exchange, notwithstanding the hour. So I'm very happy to be here today for that reason. One other recognition, if you will, of the people that make all these things happen, and what's really important about Ross's Institute and this law school is Jesse Deno, whose name is perhaps not known to you, but he is the indefatigable staff writer for Cityland. Everybody knows Cityland, but we know Jesse, and he's the staff writer for Cityland, which is, as you know, the Center for New York City's Law's Chronicle, if you will, of all of the actions undertaken by the various agencies and commissions that affect land use. Jesse's every Tuesday. There's nobody at the Landmarks hearings as much, and he's there all the time as Jesse. He's in the first row. He's a regular fixture. He covers our decisions and our actions more regularly and with as much accuracy, or sometimes more, than any other reporter in New York City. And I'd like to thank him for doing a great job. So I'm here, and I always find these events, this particular breakfast, to be as interesting or more so in the Q&A portion at both of those microphones. So I'll leave enough time to do that. And Ross, tell me if I've gone over a little bit or just give me any guidance along the way. So But I am here to tell you not only about the Landmarks Commission and about how it works, but what we've accomplished since I was last here, which was about 3 years ago. Maybe that's where and I had been in the chairmanship, the great honor, truly, and privilege of being in the chairmanship of this commission for about a year and a half or so at that time. But since that time, what has happened at the commission? But also in more general terms, to give you my insights and observations about how preserving New York's character can coexist or fit in with, if you will, this current explosion that Ross talks about, the explosive growth that we've seen in virtually every part of this city, in every neighborhood, and every borough, and how our role of preserving the city's past, in fact, I believe, is not at odds with that, although there are occasional flashpoints, of course, there have to be. It's the creative tensions, if you will. But in fact, what we do in preserving the city's past actually enriches and enhances its future. I think that's a truism, but I think particularly in a time of great economic growth, which we all applaud, it's even more important, and I think we are keeping pace. But briefly, let me go back a little to the future, if you will, to the Commission's history, and I've referred to this a couple of times, no great insight, but basically as a tale of two train stations, McKim, Mead and White's Pennsylvania Station and Warren and Wetmore's Grand Central Terminal. And it was the demolition of Penn Station in 1963, which, it's been called, and I heartily endorse this as a characterization as if not the most, one of the most notorious acts of civic vandalism to ever befall New York City. And public concern had been building, of course, prior to that, in the late 50s and early 60s over the loss of other historic buildings in the city. But that event and other things that were happening at the time galvanized the preservation movement. And it led to the passage of the city, it directly led to the passage of the city's landmarks law in 1965 and the establishment of the commission by Mayor Wagner. And I was proud in my other years that in government that Ross referred to when I was in City Hall with Mayor Koch, and to be a colleague and close friend of, speaking of Mayor Wagner, of Bobby Wagner, and I learned an enormous amount about government, about history, and yes, indeed, about preservation, not knowing then how that would be a part of my life today. And I miss him now, and I miss his wisdom and his counsel and his decency and everything he stood for in government. And anyone in this room that ever had any contact with him, I'm sure, has the same feeling. And it's a great loss. It was a great loss. But back to Penn Station, if it gave birth to the preservation movement that, and in effect it did, then Grand Central Terminal actually established the resilient and powerful backbone of that movement. And this became dramatically apparent when the Landmarks Commission, refused to allow a 55-story tower to be constructed above the station. The Commission's decision was appealed in the courts until it finally reached the United States Supreme Court in 1978, and that court ultimately upheld the Commission's denial of the tower. And in his opinion, this is truly a landmark, no pun intended, but you got to say it, this is a landmark decision. And Justice Brennan wrote, "Structures with special historic, cultural, or architectural significance enhance the quality of life for all." That was a holding, that was a finding by Justice Brennan on the facts of that case and on a challenge to the validity and the powers of the New York City Landmark Commission. He concluded that these buildings not only represent the special features of the past, but they serve as examples of quality for the future, for the present and for the future. Quite literally, again, a landmark decision, of course, and now New York City is widely regarded as having the toughest, most powerful, most far-reaching landmarks protection law in the country. And we use that power, I hope, we try to use it, and I have one of my fellow commissioners here, Diana Chapin, who I value as a terrific colleague, and Diana and I and the other 9 members of the commission, I believe, exercise that power judiciously and thoughtfully, day in and day out at the Landmarks Commission, particularly on Tuesdays when we have our public hearings and public meetings. But we're basically going if not 24/7, then certainly close to it, and working constantly on these matters. You see the sort of a little bit of the tip of the iceberg, if you will, to some extent on the public hearings and the public meetings, but there's an enormous amount of work being done all the time to keep pace with all of the things that I've described earlier. And let me just briefly summarize. It's known to many of you, but not to everyone, exactly how it works. The Commission is really two bodies. It's comprised of a city agency and an independent panel of 10 commissioners appointed by the mayor who are unpaid. Appointed by the mayor, as I said, at least one of whom is from each of the 5 boroughs. That's a statutory requirement. Diana happens to be from Queens. Jax lives in Jackson Heights, and appointed by the mayor, representing the 5 boroughs. And then in addition, other statutory requirements are at least 3 architects, a planner, a realtor, so-called, and a historian. And I have the great privilege of being the chairman of the commission, and in that there are dual roles, effectively become the commissioner of the agency and then chair these Tuesday public meetings and public hearings. So the agency part of it is a staff of 65, now 65. It was 45 when I began, and it's now 65, and highly dedicated, highly educated, highly motivated, I can't say it enough, architectural historians, art historians, archaeologists, lawyers. Mark Silberman, my counsel of the commission, is over there, one of the top lawyers in the field, and certainly a fierce defender of the powers, duties, and obligations of the Landmarks Commission, and in its fight for preservation and carrying out our duties. But lawyers, preservationists who take very seriously our mission to protect the city's architectural and in historic integrity. We may be the smallest agency in New York City, which I'm not quite sure that we are, but we're certainly among the smaller. But we are the largest, by far, municipal preservation agency in the United States. And there are more than 24,000 buildings under the jurisdiction of the Commission right now. And that includes, obviously, individual landmarks and, of course, any building that's contained within a historic district. So they are treated, not only treated, but they have the same status and legal force and effect and protections as if they were individual landmarks. So a total of over 24,000, and that number is continuing to grow, which I'll get to in a moment. But there are 2 departments, basically, fundamentally a research department, which, as it sounds, does the research and prepares for and presents to me and others in the commission new opportunities, new considerations for as we move forward with additional historic districts and individual designations. Research that doesn't come out of thin air. It requires enormous work, enormous outreach, enormous internal research, and all the people that I've described earlier are engaged in that, and it's critical. It's a critical mission of the agency. So the research department proposes buildings and neighborhoods that could be eligible, may be eligible for designation, to a committee in the agency comprised of members of the senior staff and the chairman standing here before you, who then, after extensive study and winnowing and getting more information, evaluating expert opinions and expert views from all sources, and being presented to me by Mary Beth Betts, who is a renowned historian in this field, who I am just couldn't be happier to have as the director of the research department, and then make a judgment at that point, after it's winnowed up through that process, of whether or not these new historic districts, new buildings should be presented to the next stage, which is to Diana and her fellow commissioners for consideration about where do we go now? Do we bring it to the full commission? Does it pass all those threshold tests? And that's how, in general, very truncated way, very summarily telling you how the process works on that side of the house. Meanwhile, the preservation staff, headed by Sarah Carroll, is charged with overseeing the changes to the existing buildings and making sure that those changes are appropriate. Critical word in our field. A lot of room and flexibility in the definition of that term. It's why we have an expert commission to make the judgments, those discretionary judgments based on advice of our expert staff, and as to whether or not any change to a landmark, already existing landmark building is appropriate. That is, in general, whether it's consistent with the building's principal elements: composition, the massing, the materials, the style, scale, design, whole series of factors that are then weighed by the commission in a public setting, when necessary, when it's not covered by the rules already promulgated by the commission. If a change that's proposed meets the rules that themselves have been adopted in a public hearing and after public testimony and review, then if it's outside of those rules, but someone says, notwithstanding that, I'd like to make this kind of change instead of that kind of change, then it would go to the full commission. And then the full commission has the power to make determination based on appropriateness, as I've described it. So the staff permits, though, we have 9,800 applications a year that are handled. It's a lot of activity. And of the 9,800, substantial portion, in the range of 90 or so percent, are in fact handled. They meet the rules and they're handled by the staff. Doesn't mean that they're sort of in and out, rubber stamped at all. Hardly. Some of them are quick. Some of them are even you could have a staff permit for hundreds of windows in a place like Rockefeller Center, let's say, that meets the rules, but nonetheless, and therefore requires staff approval, which is a simpler procedure than a public hearing or a public meeting, but nonetheless requires an enormous amount of review, drawings, time, and effort by the Landmarks Commission staff. And then, so the other additional 5%, whatever it might be, the commissioners make the decisions. They decide on alterations not specified under the rules that I said. And just in the last 6 or 8 months, the kinds of high-profile decisions that are made by the commission on these kinds of matters include, and you've probably seen some reference to them from time to time, paint color on the Guggenheim Museum, spirited debate back and forth. All kinds of many people in this room contributed to it, and important debate, hugely important. Frank Lloyd Wright. How can anything be more important, frankly, than that? A rooftop Tuesday, a rooftop addition, if you will, to the Battery Maritime building down at the tip of Lower Manhattan. Beautifully restored Battery Maritime building, but unfortunately not usable in a way that was meaningful to the city. A small, modest, appropriate rooftop addition to that building enables it to, A, it's appropriate in terms of architecture and style, and B, it allows the reanimation of that building as a gateway, as a reanimation, helping to reanimate the waterfront, and as an important, vibrant gateway to Governor's Island. It's where the Governor's Island ferries are parked or come in and out of, slip, whatever the nautical term is, Julie. And big decision, but still, before the commission, just like somebody coming in the same principles or same kind of considerations, somebody coming in for a new window or a small or a stoop on his or her building on the Upper West Side or in the Village or whatever. So these are all in the range of things that take place. 35 items at public hearing every Tuesday, comes to over 1,000 a year, all in the light and the sunshine of the day, everything wide open. Community board participation. Nobody gets on a calendar at the Landmarks Commission for an application without first going to the community board. It's not required by law, but it is required by our practices. And that input, that response is critically important. Advocates are always omnipresent and contributing and bringing to our attention both their opinions and their knowledge, and that's invaluable. And anyone else, any other member of the public, come down on a Tuesday, municipal building, 9th floor, go to the hearings, go drop in and out. It's fascinating, and we learn a lot from the public hearings, and I think they help inform the decisions in a meaningful way. Doesn't mean the two that I mentioned are high profile and approved, but there are some that not everything's approved. Big surprise. There was a proposal for, not to single anything out, but just as by way of example, a proposal for another tower, a proposed rooftop addition / tower, if you will, on the Upper East Side on Madison Avenue above Sotheby's, and that application in the Upper East Side Historic District was not approved. And then as I was hinting at, other less noticed but equally important changes that affect the city streetscape. The windows for Tudor City, new fencing around apartment buildings in Jackson Heights that Diana knows well, new building on an empty lot in Brooklyn Heights, and new garage for a single-family house in in Douglaston, Queens. So on any given Tuesday, this is what's happening there. And we make thousands of those decisions. The 9,800 permits I referred to, and that's the preservation side of it. The designation side, just to go back to that for a moment, last year we granted landmark status to 1,158 buildings across the city, which is the highest number of designations at the Commission since 1990. And it was a good year, and we're moving forward, and we're doing more designations. We're being as active as we can be. I'm not going to say I don't like the word proactive, but we are a very active commission, and we have stepped up our designations, and we've stepped up our research capacity, and we've stepped up our survey capacity with the in budget enhancements that we have been able to gain over the years, often with the City Council's concurrence and assistance, and but basically driven by the mayor's executive budget. So that has enabled me as chairman to achieve, I believe, to make substantial progress toward achieving two critical goals that I set after being appointed, or when I was appointed in 2003 by the mayor. And first was to increase the number of large historic districts outside Manhattan, and two, to protect, example, of the city's industrial heritage, some on the waterfront and some not. And since 2003, we've designated 18 new historic districts. 7 of them are in the Bronx, Staten Island, Queens, or Brooklyn. Sunnyside Gardens, I'll just run through them very quickly, a couple of highlights. Sunnyside Gardens in Queens, the largest district in Queens with 624 low-rise brick buildings, comprise the first garden city in the United States. Critically important from architectural history point of view, and the subject of some controversy. As big surprise, everything we do has some controversy or other attached to it. Even the most seemingly mother and apple pie kind of application somehow always manages to stir up. But that's good. There's dissent, there's argument, there's discussion, and then hopefully a reasoned decision. I believe strongly a reasoned decision. Jump to the Bronx, Fieldston Historic District. Largest in the Bronx that the commission was able to designate in 2004. Comprises a romantic planned suburban community. For those who are there, who live there or been there, you know what I'm talking about. 257 single-family residences vary in style architecturally. Mediterranean, Tudor, Georgian colonial, medieval. It also makes a good point about a historic district does not have to be all of a kind, all row houses or all brownstones. It can have that eclectic mix that Fieldston has and many other historic districts has. Brooklyn, Crown Heights, historic district, 472 apartment buildings, row houses, mansions that were designed by many prominent Brooklyn architects in styles ranging from Romanesque revival, Queen Anne, to Georgian Renaissance revival. Again, an eclectic mix, a district that I was proud to do that truly was from the grassroots it was a meeting of the grassroots in the community, and the councilman Al Van, who was a strong proponent, always helpful to have the council's person in whose district we're working to be strongly on our side, and Oliver Coppell was in the Bronx as well, and Fieldston and Eric Joya in Sunnyside. That it's essential. The council has review authority over historic districts and historic designations, and have the ability to vote up or down on those districts. So it's critically important, and it's not just the approval, but also being able to marshal the community and work with us on the education process as we go through. Designating a historic district when you're dealing with people's homes, these are all residential areas that I've described, it's a huge responsibility. And we all love landmarks. I mean, everybody it's obvious that's where people start. But then you work into the specifics, and there's a lot that has to be explained. You're saying what you can, and you're affecting the ability of people of homeowners to, in effect, do what they wish or please with. After all, it's their own property, their own house. But there are reasonable restraints that are imposed and set on all kinds of other things, and that allow us to work together as a society and with a governmental overlay, and we're part of that. It happens perhaps sometimes to hit closer to home, no pun intended, and therefore becomes sometimes more contentious. But it can be addressed. I think it is addressed, and ultimately we're able to prevail based on being able to demonstrate that our regulatory hand is fair and light, and particularly where appropriate, and ultimately the restrictions, if you will, on changes to your home also apply to all the rest of the people down the street and across the street, and ultimately you will live in a better place over the years, and next generations will. And the property values not only won't fall, there's some strong evidence that, in fact, property values in historic districts increase at a higher rate than not. So, but having said all that's at the end of the process. At first blush, you mean I can't put a new door on? I can't put a window in the back of my house because of the Landmarks Commission? So, and then we answer those questions. We go to the communities, we talk to people, we go back and forth, and ultimately we get, I believe, substantial approval, substantial support for what we're doing. The survey I referred to earlier, we are with a new survey team of people who are going out throughout the city to get ahead of the designation curve, if you will, to be able to comprehensively look at, now it's over 18,000 or so buildings, and a survey as you go out in the field, photographs, date of construction, research the architecture, research the style, so that there's a snapshot, if you will, of what's out there, a sense of what the universe is, the inventory, so that when there are requests for additional historic designations or individual designations, hopefully we are ready to do a quick turnaround. Some of the surveys lead directly to immediate designation or immediately beginning the formal process. Others are put on the shelf, if you will, and are there so that we can make a quick judgment when and if those, either there's, God forbid, an endangered property, but that happens, everybody knows that, that's clear, that's not a great way to have to deliberate in this field, but that it does happen, these emergencies, and where there are threats, particularly, I think perhaps particularly in a time of great economic activity, but so we're aware of that. So, and then just to go quickly through, we haven't forgotten Manhattan. I have emphasized the boroughs outside Manhattan. So we've done a survey, and we've surveying buildings from 14th to 57th Street in Manhattan. We've designated several other historic districts, including Greenwich Village, Weehawken. We're now looking at the South Village, West Chelsea. Ed Kirkland knows well, is very much on a fast track. Very interesting grouping of buildings in West Chelsea and in NoHo. So moving in all the other boroughs actively and aggressively, but also Manhattan Avenue, wonderful historic district up and off of Central Park. The industrial heritage will go quickly through Domino Sugar, Eberhard Faber Pencil Factory in Greenpoint, and in December, Dumbo, a neighborhood that helped establish Brooklyn as the nation's fourth largest manufacturing center in the 19th century and through the first decades of the 20th century. All of these designated landmarks, some of them immediately being adaptively reused creatively, like Domino Sugar, Summer Piano Factory in Queens, and ST Piano up in the Bronx. What's particularly remarkable is that all of this activity that I'm describing has taken place against the backdrop of one of the most robust periods of growth the city has ever seen. And I think it actually proves that moving the city forward and preserving its great heritage are by no means mutually exclusive. I think that they are compatible. They can and do go hand in hand. And we make this possible with the collaboration I talked about with owners, communities, civic and elected officials, also other city agencies that are pushing for more opportunities for everyone in the city, whether it's affordable housing in Crown Heights or an affordable housing project actually in the Bronx, in Longwood area of the Bronx, for grandparents raising their grandchildren, preserved and reused, a wonderful individual landmark there, and we're able to work it together with the facility I've described that was quite touching, actually, for grandparents raising their grandchildren. And then whether it's the rezoning of Jamaica or 125th Street, or whether to build a park on Peck Slip in Lower Manhattan, a new playground in Central Park, or new rules to make our historic buildings safer, we're always there, we're involved, and we're making things better. As Justice Brennan said, to go back to him to sort of almost conclude this, we enhance the quality of life for all in the city. And we're also not unaware of the green movement for a sustainable city. We're part of that as well. Sustainable really does begin, the best green project is preservation, is not to tear it down, basically. It's sort of a central truism that is often ignored in the rush to a LEED building and a platinum building and a gold building, but wait a minute, what was there before? Preservation actually is the ultimate recycling. And when we approach owners about the idea of designating, but when we do talk about designating the building, we do encourage adaptive reuse, of course. That would be our first hope and threshold. We can't enforce it, but obviously, but we urge it. And many of these older buildings were really built to last. The walls are thicker, ceilings higher, windows are larger, and reduces the need for heating and cooling. They also embody a great deal of energy. Embodied energy, I believe, is the buzzword, right, Mark? That was expended to put them there in the first place. And if they're torn down, that disappears. So we're learning and advocating and these green issues and trying to be creative about it and trying to urge people to move in what we think is an appropriate direction, and letting people know what is helpful and useful and positive about it. And I think it's being embraced clearly in the adaptive reuse. Domino Sugar is a good example. There's the American Banknote Factory in former manufacturing plant in Hunts Point. They're going to restore the building. I believe it's Taconic Partners. They're restoring the building. They're converting it for commercial and retail uses. We just designated it. It's possible it could have been torn down. I mean, who knows? Very possible. That happens all the time. And so it will become, we think and hope, an economic anchor in that neighborhood. So this all demonstrates to you that we're not only, that New York's landmarks are not only cultural, architectural, and historic treasures, but they can also be valuable, sustainable assets. And it's my intent, and that of the Commission, to continue moving along this path in the months and years ahead. Stay tuned. There are, last time I checked, yesterday, 686 days on that clock in the bullpen, and we're not stopping. Thank you very much. And questions, Ross? Okay. Sure.
We have microphones on both sides. I want to thank Bob for mentioning Cityland. We do work very hard on that. There's a staff of people that work on it, and if you haven't seen it, we try and cover every single landmark decision, either here or through our website, and we hope that you have a chance to look at it, and if you like it, subscribe. One more announcement. Just to give you the idea of the breadth of these breakfasts, we're going from landmarks to prisons next time. March 28th, we're going to have Martin Horn come and speak about a topic that is exceedingly important in this city, the prisons and what's going on inside them, and also the expansion of them back to the boroughs. It's a topic that we don't often have a chance to hear much about, and I hope that you will come and hear him as well. So let's start with the questions as we do. Roger Hers.
Roger Hers, time, an acronym for to improve municipal efficiency. One of the troublemakers in the early 60s as a member of the staff of city planning. What ripples has New York's law and commission had in the rest of the country?
Around the country? That's had a great ripple. I think, as I said earlier, we're the leader certainly in size and scope and the inventory that we preside over. I think people, just as New York City and many other fields, all fields that I can think of, particularly in government, people look to the city for direction, leadership, guidance, and I believe, and I know it's not just anecdotal when we go to, I'm not out going to a lot of conferences around the country, not able to do that, but am able to read and talk to people in the field, whether it's at the National Trust in Washington or reading the literature in preservation. And New York City Landmarks Commission, not only the content and substance of what we do, but the nature of the coverage, if you will. We do something, it's as likely as not to end up in the New York Times, and that has a ripple effect. So I believe it's an enormously important impact, and hopefully all for the good.
Thank you for the good work.
Let me also mention on Cityland, Molly Brennan, who was the predecessor. She is the greatest. She's still here, and I wanted to thank her for everything she did, helping start up Cityland and cover the Landmarks Commission. And Melanie, of course. Melanie, thank you. Where do we go?
Bernie Kabak.
Yeah.
Two quick questions. Over the last 2 decades or so, there's been a more vocal, if not more effective, movement within the legal community for property rights. I'm asking whether you've felt the influence of that movement in your work. The second question is that you've expressed some anxiety about the pending possible demolition of the American Banknote building. How does the Commission approach Yankee Stadium?
No, American Banknote is not going to be demolished. It was designated so that any thoughts of demolition
Well, what about Yankee Stadium?
have long disappeared. Yankee Stadium, the American Banknote is a designated landmark, and Yankee Stadium is not and was not.
Why wouldn't it be?
Well, it's an academic point at this moment, but it was never not. It had never been, over the years of the existence of the Landmarks Commission, had never been designated. I can't give you all the reasons. On property rights, if you're talking about the property rights movement, if you will, that manifests itself in litigation and First Amendment due process rights, we do see that Mark sees it in a litigation context. I don't think the property rights movement is as strong in New York City as it is in other parts of the country that will remain nameless, but I believe that there are other places where it's more active and aggressive. But I am very respectful and mindful of property rights, not as a movement, but individual property rights. And as I tried to describe earlier, when people come to the Commission, that is foremost and prominent in my consciousness and the consciousness of the staff and the Commission, to put oneself in the shoes of the people coming to you, if you will, and say, well, how would I feel about what's being proposed here? It's got to be explained. It's got to be, there needs to be convincing and persuasion through the ideas that preservation is a positive value, and we work through it that way. But it's something I'm totally mindful of all the time.
Good morning. My name is David Bloomfield. I'm a Brooklynite.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you pointed out the individual from Verizon, because as most Brooklynites know, as we walk across the bridge or as people try to take wedding photographs from the ferry landing, the big Verizon sign mars the viewscape, the skyline, the sublime skyline of New York City. And I'm wondering what the Landmarks Preservation Commission is doing to preserve the skyline.
Let me ask you, let me not ask you, but first let me say, I thought you were going to go toward the other side of when you mentioned Verizon. In Brooklyn, at a 101 Willoughby Street, a former Verizon headquarters building, New York Telephone, owned by Verizon, worked with Verizon to landmark that building. It's now turned into Bell-Tel Towers, and beautifully adaptively reused and restored. And it could not have been designated a landmark, and God knows what would have happened to it without the cooperation, the full cooperation and partnership of Verizon and Tom Dunn and all of his colleagues. So that's a huge plus. The building you're talking about, I know it well. I know the building well. It's definitely not a landmark building, and I think we all know why. The sign, therefore, is outside of our purview of jurisdiction. So I'm not going to ask, this is not Tom's event, and I'm not going to ask him to answer it, but it's not within our purview.
What about the viewscape in general? And
viewscapes aren't designated. We're obviously, per se, I mean, there are scenic landmarks that are under the law that are permitted, but a scenic landmark is not a skyline. It's a New York City park, as Henry knows, and those are the scenic landmarks we have. We just have a handful of them. I believe there are either 9 or 13, including the smallest one, Verdi Park, Henry will know, and the larger Prospect and Central Park. But we don't do that kind of. I'm very mindful of it. I love the New York City. Who doesn't? The New York City skyline, but it is not within the regulatory ambit of the commission.
You know, I'm so ancient, Henry Stern. So I remember when the Landmarks Commission was part of the Parks Department.
Yes. And
I'm delighted you gained your independence, and you're doing well with it. Also, you're a terrific chairman. You're not only very knowledgeable, but you're very patient. I don't know if most people could listen to all the stuff you listen to. But you're also, I want to raise a new thing. Have you thought of yourself as the geographic spear carrier of the nanny state?
I haven't. I have not.
When you tell someone if you can put a window in his house or not, I'm not talking about huge areas.
Understand.
Okay, so that's on one side. The other side, at the rate you're going, you wonder how many years it will take you until you have more properties than Amanda Burden on your jurisdiction. But this is my question.
There's a million buildings in New York City, as you know. As our former mentor, mayor, you said there's a million of everything in New York City.
What I wanted to ask, and I'll skip over to the photographs of abandoned buildings, what it would be like if we had you in 17. Yes?
Mark Silberman and I are working on that issue, so we can
good,
talk about that
good.
later.
Well, that's terrific. That's terrific. And the what it would be like if your agency had been established in, say, 1765.
That's a trick question.
But let me ask the question I want to. There are a lot. This is the question.
Yes.
Past this prologue. What do you do? I think of you as you are. Your agency is a good, solid agency representing the general good over a specific goods where people can make more money. What do you do about all the people who now hear the meetings who denounce you? who say that you're an instrument of the administration,
Yeah.
that you're insensitive, that you're really the pawn of the whoever, real estate, the brokers, or whatever, and who come to meetings and who they denounce it, wonderful plan for who denounce wonderful plans, either because they're antiquarians who want everything to be just the way it is and who regard the existing landscape as a sacred sculpture, or because they want to preserve their light and air, and a lot of other reasons why people oppose landmarking for reasons of either personal gain or peculiar whim. How do you handle that?
We keep doing what we're doing, and I think the record speaks for itself. We act honestly and fairly, and based on all the evidence and based on the landmarks law. And we establish our credibility by being straight, honest, fair, and not being sidetracked by extraneous issues. But you're right, they're raised all the time, but many of them have little or nothing to do with the landmarks law and preservation as it's executed under the landmarks law. So I try to keep my eye on the future and do the job well with an enormously committed staff and enormously committed commission and move ahead. And I hope that at the end of the day, the record that I've partially described here will speak for itself.
Thank you. That answer will stand up in any court. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jeff Siegel, and I'm a resident of the Upper West Side, and I'm also a member of Community Board 7. And as I'm sure you know, some of our city's most beautiful buildings are our houses of worship. And with dwindling congregations, with skyrocketing expenses, and maintaining very old buildings, a lot of our congregations are being forced to go to developers to ask for help. And due to the zoning resolution and the difficulty sometimes in arranging the structure of buildings, often the only reasonable financial solution for congregations and developers is to actually tear down some of these beautiful structures. My question to you is, what are you doing in coordination with the mayor's office, in coordination with the city council, to try to reach some type of reasonable accommodation here that might allow these houses of worship to continue, the congregations to continue financially, but that we can also save these buildings that are so valuable to the community, to the fabric of what we view as important to our architectural heritage. And in particular, I was wondering if the commission or you or anyone in city government had given any consideration to the possibility of allowing houses of worship and perhaps not-for-profit institutions to transfer their development rights beyond just individual zoning lots across the street and maybe to some larger area like a community board district or 20-block radius of the structure.
All good ideas. Terrible, thorny problem that you've mentioned. We're not only mindful of it, but aggressively acting to address it, particularly where it is most acute and where there is a specific situation. Our purview, of course, extends to, or is limited by, if you will, but the churches, houses of worship that are either under the jurisdiction of the Landmarks Commission as already being designated or have the potential to be designated. And where those churches become part of the complex you're talking about, the situation, this very volatile, threatening situation, we are very active but sensitive to the degree to which we can intervene. There is an issue of the First Amendment issues in church and state, but that's not a serious obstacle to our being involved, and have been. I know in some of the issues with the Roman Catholic Church, we have been, I think, successful in some and not successful in others, but we have engaged the Archdiocese of New York in those discussions and have designated Catholic churches in this for the first time in 25 years, some in Harlem, some on the East Side, in other parts of the city, and have also been able to persuade the Archdiocese to consider either adaptive reuse or other uses of churches. But there are other it's not always successful. And we are working with the council. I'm not going to name the council people, but there are a lot of them. Some of them well known to you that I'm working with right now on some of the sort of hot button issues. The long-term issue in terms of development rights, that's also something that we're actively considering that requires and we are discussing it. And ultimately that would require interagency action. But it's an idea that's been around for a time. Doesn't mean it's not valid. And maybe it needs what you said about a 20-block radius perhaps is a better, one of the problems with that idea was transferring all of these rights to a part of the city then which becomes inundated with unsympathetic high-rise buildings. So if it can be circumscribed better. So they're all good ideas. It's a serious issue. It's not one that we're not engaged in and involved in.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good morning. Eric Wallman from Sheepshead Bay. First, congratulations on Sunnyside Gardens. I have friends who live there. I'm very gratified by the decision.
Great.
As was I, because I visit and I enjoy
Terrific.
the neighborhood.
Good.
Sheepshead Bay landmarking is not a critical issue, but overdevelopment is.
Mm-hmm.
And with the recession, I'm hoping that since the people in charge of land use and zoning have been slow to respond to overdevelopment, I'm hoping there'll be some invisible hand solution to the destruction of private homes and building of high-rise condos. What impact do you think the recession will have on your work?
I'm not an economist, hasten to state. And anecdotally, right now, we've had 9,800 permit. You'd see it, I guess, quote-unquote recession, whatever that exactly means. But if there's a slowdown in economic activity, it often has, it reverberates into many areas of activity, and which would theoretically or possibly include, maybe you'd see the number of permits go down. You might see fewer applications, fewer development deals, but I haven't seen any of that, actually. That's what, by way of saying that might take place. It hasn't taken place yet. So, but that would probably be how it would manifest itself.
Hi, good morning. This is not a setup. My name is Steve Barrison, and I happen to be president of the Bay Improvement Group from Sheepshead Bay.
Yeah.
And but this is a very important morning for me. Landmarks is near and dear to my heart. I was with Ed and others on the 25th anniversary committee. I spent 5 years as a dedicated volunteer back in the 80s for the Landmarks Commission. We worked hard on the Lundy designation. Those of you that remember Lundy's restaurant, which I'm sad to say is covered with improper signs and crazy neon signs and all kinds of things. Maybe you guys can look into that. That's the single biggest call we get almost every week in Sheepshead Bay is what in the world are they doing to that poor building, which is about to be a gourmet shop, talking about use.
Well, then they've got to clean. Hopefully it'll be.
Hopefully the signage problem will be taken care of.
We got
I want to make a couple of important comments. Number one, you spoke about love your landmarks. And the 25th anniversary committee, our T-shirts said, love your landmarks.
Yeah.
I still kept that T-shirt. It's like a once-a-year thing. I'll break it out and wear it. I think the most important thing I find, I'm also the executive vice president of the Small Business Congress. I've come to these meetings before, and I travel around the city, and I do occasionally bring up landmarks in addition to talking about small business and all that. Most of the public, outside of all of you in the room and those that are educated about the process, are ignorant about landmarks and still afraid of them. And I think perhaps your commission, as great as it is, certainly needs more funding, certainly could be even bigger. You may be a small, but you're doing very big things for now and for the future generations. And it's important to do education through preservation. I have met with churches, and even in Sheepshead Bay, there's one church just a few blocks north of Lundy's that was built in 1840. It's a remarkable building. It was there when all of the whole south end of Brooklyn was farmland. And talking with the trustees of the board, they're all old enough to be my grandparents, were so afraid of landmarking, despite my meeting with them and showing them the positive and money's available, federal, state, and city, they were not interested. And perhaps the Landmarks Commission can come to certain buildings like this, which stand out from others, and meet with these people directly rather than wait for them to come to you.
We try to do that within the limits of, within our capacity, and it's a critical issue. You're right. There are a lot of misconceptions and a lot of fears, and we do take them on, if you will, address them, and hopefully overcome them in specific situations. And we are increasingly trying with community meetings and the like, and through the council and through other ways, to sort of get ahead of that curve and try the education process. But it's daunting, as you found.
Well, with that, I hope you get funding,
we are.
more funding so you can get bigger and help save this great part of New York
Thank
City,
you very
all of our
much.
history. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sheldon Silberstein. I've written on New York's cable cars. Earlier, you made reference to the American Banknote Building and said it was landmarked and therefore protected from demolition. However, there is also a process of de-landmarking buildings, and it has been used, in particular, I believe it's called the Cronin Building on 6th Avenue and about 26th Street, was de-landmarked and demolished. Can you explain and justify
that? One I can't, I'm not aware of. I will ask Mark about it, whether it was, not sure it was a New York City landmark. Ed, you know?
It was defeated at the board on it years ago. Manet, the owners of it actually approached Mr. Manet, the borough person of Queens, everything corruptible.
So I'll explain. Okay. So what Ed's describing, and I believe he's describing, I have no personal knowledge of it. It was designated by the commission, but in those days, prior to when the Board of Estimate was the governing authority for validating, voting up or down on a designation. Today it's the City Council that I talked about earlier. But then it was the Board of Estimate. Board of Estimate, presumably, if this is correct, turned it back, and therefore it was never designated. But and de-designation takes place rarely, if ever. I mean, I've seen one or two, and they have been buildings that have just literally, regrettably, fallen apart through terrible lack of maintenance and care. But of the 24,000 buildings, it's on one hand, is it not, that have been designated, the number? De-designated, excuse me. So.
This side. This is the
last
question.
Yes,
okay.
Vincent Favorito. I'm a retired attorney, so I've taken off my tie. I've come from Brooklyn also, and I'm in a area, brownstone area called Carroll Gardens.
Yes.
I know you folks are interested in it. My problem again is that a lot of our homeowners are, although they're interested, they're elderly and they're house rich and cash poor.
I know.
There is an area there called the Place Blocks, which was a planned community back on 1846. The plan is there, and we're looking to landmark that. But there, like the gentleman before me said, there's a big fear that this landmarking will cause these homeowners to have to expend a great deal of money. I'd like to have the commission help us dispel that fear and send us to areas where they can get tax rebates.
Sure.
Remember, buildings get 25-year tax rebates. Homeowners don't get any tax rebates.
I know. We would like to.
So I think there's some balance there that should be accomplished.
And one other thing about landmarks, we've been to Carroll Gardens and looking at it, and have had meetings, community meetings to address that kind of issue and other things. But one sort of short-term answer to lessen those kinds of immediate fears is if a building is landmarked, designated in a historic district, nothing has to be changed. Everything that's voted, the day we landmark a building, its grandfather, if you will, its condition is exactly as it is that day. We don't then rush in and say, change this, change that, bring it back, do this, do that. Nothing. So any change that is never mandated, it would be when someone who owns that house wishes to make a change, then we have a voice in that. But so
I fully understand that,
but
we have to
people
get to
don't.
work, and the people, there is a lot of voices in the community which have different interests, and prey upon people with lack of information.
Right.
So we're trying to get out there to try to correct them, and we need your help to give us more information and to give us areas of helping us with information and education.
We will help you.
Thank
you.
Okay.
Okay.
One more question. Sorry about it. Well,
This has been a wonderfully interesting morning and a discussion about landmarks, one of our most important city functions and something that we all care so much about, and delighted that you shared the morning with us. As we always do, we like to give a product of scholarship to our speakers, and this one wasn't written here, but by up the street by NYU professor William Nelson, Fighting for the City, A History of the New York City Corporation Council. We had an important CLE program last month on this, and we're going to have a full issue of our New York Law School Law Review on it, written by all of the, including Mayor Koch, who you served and I served. And with your long experience in city government, I thought this is the appropriate gift today. So to our speaker.
Thank you very much. Good. Delighted to be here. Thank you.
We will see you on March 28th when Martin Horn, Commissioner of the Department of Corrections, will be talking about New York City prisons. Thank you all.
Yeah, there was nowhere to eat in my office. I'm the oldest in the building. You know, everything in the land.